If you'll take your Bibles and turn with me to the book of Mark, Mark chapter 14. This is a story that's told in 3 of the 4 Gospels. As all the other stories in the Gospels, it is a true story. And we find out a little bit more information in each telling of it, but I think I'd like to focus on what we find here in Mark chapter 14. It says in verse 3 that Jesus was in Bethany. It says, verse 3, "And being in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at meat, there came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious. And she brake the box and poured it on his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves, and said, Why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence, and have been given to the poor. And they murmured against her. And Jesus said, Let her alone. Why trouble ye her? She hath wrought a good work on me. For ye have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will, ye may do them good, but me ye have not always. She hath done what she could. She is come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her." This is interesting because Jesus is saying here in this final verse that we read that he's predicting exactly what we just did. He's saying wherever this gospel is preached, and by the way, we call Mark's gospel a gospel because it's the life of Christ. But Jesus called it a gospel before it was even written. And he said wherever this gospel is preached, whether it's by Mark or by Matthew or by John, wherever this is taught of, whatever my life is spoken of throughout the world, they're also going to remember what this woman did, which is an amazing thing if you consider the people who did the things in the Bible. Most of them didn't realize that these things we would still be talking about thousands of years later, except for one. And that was this woman named Mary, and she knew that what she had just done would be remembered forever. She doesn't know how many years it will be, but she knows that it'll be forever. That's amazing. And I love what Jesus says here. He says to them, when they start to complain about her bringing this alabaster box of ointment and pouring it on the feet of Jesus, he makes a statement here, and it's, she did what she could. She hath done what she could. I'd like to preach you a message on that phrase. She hath done what she could. Now, it's interesting that the box of ointment is said in several places to be worth 300 denarii. 300 denarii, that's the word translated penny. 300 pence here in verse number 5. It's also said to be 300 pennyworth in the book of John. And that word penny translates from the word denarii. Now, the denarii was that same penny, that what we call it a penny, that in Matthew chapter 20, Jesus had told a parable about servants who come and work for a master, and they agree on a price for their day of labor. And that agreed upon price was a denarii, 1 denarii for a day's labor. And this was pretty normal. They would typically, this is a normal day's wage, 1 penny or 1 denarii. And when it's said that this is worth 300 denarii, we understand the value is 300 days of work, which would be more than a year, because you don't typically work every day of a year, but more than a year's wages. If you only take 1 day off a year, then it's just slightly under a year's wages, right? This is the amount of value that they attributed to what she had just, in their mind, wasted. And you can be forgiven for thinking maybe it was a waste. What was the point of putting perfume on Jesus' head and his feet? Of course, we know from other passages it was both his head and his feet. But what was the point of this? Could this perfume that was worth a year's wage. Now to put that in perspective, the median household income annually in Weare, New Hampshire is $94,000 a year. That's the median household income here. So if we're going to translate this to Weare, New Hampshire, that's how much we're talking about. Of course, this was probably more a year's wage for a rather poor and needy person. But and most people in America are not really extremely poor and needy. However, that's the amount of money we're talking about here. This is something that you can imagine why the disciples say in their hearts, well, couldn't this have been used in a better way? And Jesus sidesteps all of those questions, which seem to be legitimate questions. Was this the best way to use it? And he goes straight to the heart of what Mary was doing. And he says, she did what she could. And she did it for the right reasons. She did it to anoint my body for the burial. Now, this is really interesting because, remember, Jesus has been telling his disciples for some time now, nearly a year now. He's been telling them that he's going to Jerusalem and he's going to die. He's going to be betrayed. And what happens the first time that he says this to his disciples? Well, Peter pulls him aside and says, no. They don't believe it. Jesus is telling them, I'm going to die. And they don't believe it. But Mary believes it. And I have an idea as to why maybe she believes it. If you look at the book of John, you'll see this same story, but we're told here who it was. We're told here that it was Mary who poured this ointment on him. In John chapter 12, verse 1, then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then said one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, let her alone, against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. Much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Now remember the story of Lazarus, how Lazarus died, and Jesus purposefully let him die, and shows up late to raise him from the dead. And when he shows up, he's going to Bethany, which is only 2 miles from Jerusalem. His disciples say, are you sure you want to go there? Because the Jews want to put you to death. They're looking for you, and they can't find you. Now remember, it was the closer that they got to Jerusalem, the easier it would be for them to find Jesus. They might get word, Jesus is in this city or that city, but by the time the Pharisees assembled their forces and went out to try to catch Jesus, he was probably going to be gone, because now how long is it taking for the word to get to the Pharisees and then to get out? This is why when they come into Jerusalem, it's such an important moment when they come into Jerusalem on the triumphal entry, and they're there for a whole week. It's really easy for the Pharisees to find out where they are, which is also why they don't stay overnight in Jerusalem during the week. They would go out to Bethany and back. So the further they are from Jerusalem, the more safe it is because the harder it is for the Pharisees to find them. The one night that they stay in Jerusalem, they stay at a secret place that is found secretly. Remember, Jesus sends his disciples in, and they follow a man with water and say, hey, the Lord has need of this room, and it's all secret, so nobody knows where they're going to go ahead of time, because the Jews want to kill him. This is important that we understand this, because Jesus has been saying, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And then he puts himself in harm's way to do what? To raise Lazarus from the dead. And now he comes back to Bethany. And you can understand why Mary now realizes that part of the reason that the Jews want to kill Jesus, and part of the reason that she knows that they will, because Jesus has been saying that they will, is because he came and raised her brother. And in a very real sense, she knows that Jesus is going to die partly because of what he did for her. She doesn't understand that Jesus is going to die for her in the sense of dying for her sins as a sacrifice for her sins. I doubt that she understands that, but she probably gets the idea that he's dying for her because of what he did for Lazarus. And she's filled with this grateful heart, and she comes and she pours out a year's worth of ointment on Christ to anoint him for the burial, which his disciples are still completely denying. Even Peter, when he's taken later, Peter's going to take out his sword and cut off the servant of the high priest his ear, because Peter is still against this whole idea. No, Jesus, you're not going to die. But Mary believes, and in a show of her faith and in a show of her gratitude, she glorifies God by pouring out this ointment on him, on Jesus. And Jesus bypasses the question whether it was a wise use of money. And he said, she did what she could. Now, this obviously means that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were a little bit more well off than a lot of the people of their day. If she had this ointment of spikenard worth a year's wages, that's probably a family that has some wealth. Now, it makes sense then that she and her sister and her brother are living together. It's likely that they probably inherited a business from their parents and lived together running the business, right? This is probably the case, more than likely. And so there are also speculations as they probably helped Jesus, providing him money to continue to eat and to live and to continue on. They were probably Jesus was a benefactor of theirs monetarily. This is all probably the case, but the point is not how much she gave. It's not how much this was worth. Jesus doesn't care how much it was worth. He cares that she did what she could. And I wonder if this isn't something that we often miss. We often think that whatever it is that we have to give to Jesus is, not good enough or doesn't really matter. It's not really going to make a difference. And Christ doesn't really care whether what you're going to give is going to make a difference in your mind. He cares that you do what you can. Remember the woman? All she had was 2 mites, and she threw it into the offering plate, and Jesus said she gave more than everyone else. Why? Because she did what she could. And I wonder sometimes if we think that what we do for God is so insignificant that it doesn't really matter. One of the things that amazes me is how much service to God it can be to just attend a church service. This is actually stunning to me. And it's something that I've seen with my own eyes. We've had families since I've been here come and feel right at home just because there's other kids here. And that's not anything to my credit. A lot of that has to do with my kids. My children are here, and it makes other families with kids feel comfortable to bring their kids. Now, isn't that amazing how my kids who have no choice in the matter. And and they have no, but just coming to church, they have no idea that they're serving God, but God is using their attendance, You'll be amazed. Oftentimes we think that, just saying a word of encouragement to somebody is just, I feel like I wish I could actually do something more than just say I'm praying for you. But are you doing what you can? Because those things God uses. One of my favorite parts about church, and what I think when the real church service starts, is after I get done preaching and we go downstairs. And it's not because of the food. Yes, I'm a Baptist. But it's more than that. It's when we get together as a church and we begin fellowship and we start to take the things we've just heard in the scriptures and we're talking about it and we're going back and forth and being a blessing and an encouragement with each other. This is, I think, the key. And so many people think, well, you know what? Here's why people get out of church, right? It's not usually I'm just not going to go to church anymore. That's very rare. Typically, it's they get out of the habit of going to church. And usually the reason is because one day they just felt like, I've got other things to do, and it really doesn't matter. I'm not really doing anything good for anybody. I'm not really serving God. This doesn't really matter. A lot of people do the same thing with their money. I can't give a whole lot to the church, so what I can give just isn't really going to make much of a difference. And Christ isn't concerned with how much your giving or how much you do affects things, right? What he's concerned with is, are you doing what you can? Now, if we're looking at this from a physical point of view, from this temporal, carnal perspective, Judas sounds pretty smart here, right? I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to take a year's worth of salary and just pour it at the feet of Jesus, even if he is going to die. It's not going to keep him from dying. How could that help anything? But Jesus says, forget that. She did what she could to glorify and honor me. And here's the question I wonder that if we can ask ourselves this morning, are we doing what we can? Are we taking advantage? You might say, I'm not going to share the gospel with that person because I know they aren't interested. But are you doing what you can? It's not about whether you think it's going to be effective. It's about what you can do versus what you are doing. Jesus made this statement, and it's amazing. She hath done what she could. She has come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. And this is why Jesus says, everyone's going to talk about this. Wherever this gospel is preached, everyone's going to talk about this thing. Why? Because she did everything she could. And you might have thought it wasn't going to be very effective, but yet here we are thousands of years later talking about it and learning from it. So you tell me, was it effective or not? Right? Clearly it was. It was amazingly effective, and it wasn't even unprecedented. Luke chapter 10 tells us about another woman. Luke chapter 7 tells us about another woman who also comes to see Jesus and pours ointment at him on his feet. Look what it says in Luke chapter 7. Now we know this is a different event because this one, the other one, takes place in the house of Simon the leper. It's assumed that Jesus healed him, but he used Simon the leper. This one, in Luke chapter 7, takes place in the house of another man named Simon, but he's not Simon the leper. Look what it says in verse 36. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. This guy's name is Simon, we find out later, but he's a Pharisee. Now, there's two reasons we know this can't be the same Simon as Simon the leper. Number one, because you cannot be a leper and a Pharisee. And you have to train to be a Pharisee pretty much all of your life. So there's not somebody who was a leper up until Jesus healed him and boom, they became a Pharisee. That's not the case. Also, remember that the Pharisees are trying to kill Jesus at this time when it takes place, when Mary and Martha and Lazarus, Mary brings the ointment. So Jesus was not meeting in Pharisees' houses. That would be not smart. No, this is at another man's house. This is earlier in his ministry in the town of, or near the town of Nain. And verse 37, behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner when she knew that Jesus sat at meat at the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering to him, Simon, I have somewhat to say against thee. And he says, Master, say on. And Jesus goes on into a parable to explain that he's here to save sinners. That's the whole point. So you have definitely a different scenario, right? We have a Pharisee, just his name is Simon, in a different location. And this woman brings an alabaster box of ointment, but it's not said to be ointment of spikenard. It is not said to be that valuable. Just being in an alabaster box didn't make it valuable. It was what was inside that made it so valuable. And so this was somewhat less valuable. And the Pharisee's objection, it was the Pharisee, the man whose house Jesus was in, his objection was different. It wasn't that it was a waste, but rather he said, you don't even know. If you were really a prophet, you would know who's touching you. She's a sinner. It was more, the objection was who the woman was who was touching Jesus. It appears that she was a harlot. And of course, here's the rabbi, and he's just allowing this harlot to come and touch him. Obviously, he doesn't understand that she is unclean. And of course, Jesus is going to make the point to Simon that he's the one who makes her clean rather than her making him unclean. And that was the whole point. A different scenario, but here's a woman who's filled with gratitude to Jesus for saving her and for salvation from her sin, that she breaks this box of ointment. And so when Mary gets to this moment in her life and she sees what Jesus has done for Lazarus in raising her brother from the dead, the next time Jesus comes to town, it seems that Mary has set this aside. As a matter of fact, the wording here even suggests that it's something that, it says in verse 7 of John 12, then Jesus said, let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this. So for the last, who knows how long, she's kept this, saying, this is for Jesus because he says he's going to die, and this is for him. And so she comes and she gives this to him as a show of faith in what he said, even though all the rest of his disciples don't believe it, and a show of glory to God and honor to God. And I wonder if we would have sided with her, or if we would have sided with Judas on this occasion, if we would have thought, boy, that's a big waste. And I wonder if we even look at our own lives, if we act this way ourselves. And so I want to ask the question, are you doing what you can? And to answer that question, I want to start with what we know about Mary and what she did. This is the third instance we find about Mary and what she did for Jesus. In every instance we see her, it seems like she's doing everything that she can. And there's a lot that we don't know. One day we'll get to heaven and we'll say, Mary, and we'll try to tell her own story by filling in all the gaps, and she'll say, no, that's nothing like what. But you got a few parts right, because those parts are in Scripture. And this is all we know about Mary. There's so much more, obviously, to this woman and to her life. But here's what we know. We'll take up the story beginning in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. It says this, now it came to pass, as they went, that he, that is Jesus, entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her. I love this because this is Jesus who's coming into town. He's a teacher, he's a rabbi. They would often have rabbis come into town and teach, and the men would sit at the feet of the rabbi, and the women would serve. And if the women wanted to know anything, they could ask the men later. That was the order of things, right? And here Jesus comes to town as this teacher, and Mary says, I want to hear him. So here she is, sitting with the rest of the men at the feet of Jesus. And Martha comes and says, this is wrong, Jesus. Mary should be helping me do the serving, not sitting down listening to the teaching. That's for the men, Shouldn't she be helping me? And Jesus says, I'm not going to take this away from her. She's chosen the only thing that really matters, the one thing that is actually necessary. And maybe it wouldn't be so necessary if I was just another rabbi, but I'm the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, right? God in human flesh, and she wants to sit at my feet and hear my teaching. I'm not going to take that away from her. And it's interesting that Mary started, the first thing we hear about Mary is she's just doing what she can. She doesn't know all that much at this point in her life, but she knows that Jesus is here, he's the Messiah, and I want to hear what he has to say. I want to learn. And I wonder if we sometimes, when we think about what we do for God, and when I ask that question, are you doing all that you can? Probably the first things you were thinking about were, going out on some, going door knocking or passing out tracts, or maybe giving a certain amount of funds in the offering or something like that. It's probably the first ideas that pop into the head when you think about whether or not you're doing everything you can for the Lord. But with Mary, it started with, I just want to know him. I just want to learn what he has to say. I just want to grow in my knowledge and understanding of his teaching. And I wonder if we couldn't just rewind a little bit and stop thinking about all the extra things and start with that far more needful thing. And that is just time in the Scriptures, time in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Look at the value that Mary saw. She knew she would be criticized for it. She knew this wasn't technically her place, right, in their society, but she didn't care because I want to hear what Jesus has to say. And I wonder if that's one of the things that we often just let slip, whether it's a church attendance or it's just personal time in the Word of God, studying and growing close to the Lord. But I wonder if we often see that as not really all that big of a deal. But Jesus is not asking if you've done, if you've gone on mission trips, right? He didn't ask Mary, did you give money in the offering? As a matter of fact, she did quite the opposite of that, right? She didn't give any money in the offering. And that's why the treasurer, sorry, Brother Richard, that's why the treasurer was upset about No, that's why Judas was upset, because he had his hand in the bag, right? He was, two for you, one for me type of a thing. But no, she didn't. It wasn't all the things that you would expect. Instead, she did what she could. And I think this attitude started long before that, when she just said, I just want to know what Jesus has to say. I don't really know what to do. I don't really know how to serve him. But I know one thing, I can sit here and I can learn a little bit more. I can increase in my knowledge of what it is that I'm supposed to live my life for. And this is something that I think every Christian ought to be just hungering and thirsting for. And it's one thing that I'm thrilled to see is a huge part of our church, that we just want to know the Scriptures a little bit better. Like the reason we were late was all John Paul's fault this morning. The men were late because of John Paul. We were sitting around the table, and we Well, I have a question about that, and I want to understand this a little bit better, and I have a question about this. This is a wonderful thing. And if we're going to say, yeah, I've done everything I can for Jesus when we stand before the throne, I think one of the things he's going to ask you is, really? Did you really learn the Bible like you could have? Did you really learn the Scriptures like you could have? Was that really on your heart to learn what I have for you? Or is it just you did a bunch of actions that you think satisfy me? No, Jesus is saying she did what she could. And in Luke 10, he even says, look, the one thing that is absolutely necessary for your life, Martha, Mary's got it and you don't. You know, you think you're coming at this from a position of superiority, but in fact, it's Mary who's doing correctly here. The next thing we see about Mary is in John 11. John chapter 11. So we see first, she found a seat, if you want to alliterate it all, if you're taking notes. I know Ashley likes to take notes over there. If you want to alliterate. She found a seat at the feet of Jesus. But she also submitted. You have Mary's seat and Mary's submission. Look at what happens in John 11. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. When Jesus comes, finally gets to Bethany after Lazarus is dead, Martha comes out. She says, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. I know that there's a resurrection. I get that. But he's dead now, and you could have stopped it. And then she goes and she finds Mary, and Mary comes. And look at what it says when Mary finds Jesus, verse 32 of John 11. When Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet. Now, this is something that it doesn't say about Martha. Martha's more of an action person. It's hard to get her off of her feet, I think. But Mary comes and she falls down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hast been here, my brother had not died. Therefore, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit. Here's Mary again in a place where she doesn't know what to do. So she does what she can. I mean, she just falls down at the feet of Jesus in submission to his authority. The same place, by the way, where she was before, right? She was at his feet, learning from him when everything was going well. And when everything is going wrong, where do you find Mary? You find her going to Jesus and falling down at his feet, you know? And here's Mary. She's not one of the apostles, right? She's not up on the Mount of Transfiguration. She's not learning all the ins and outs of, that the apostles are learning and getting all the things. But she's saying, whatever I can do, that I'm going to do. And when she finds Jesus, even after she's lost her brother, and she knows it's his fault, she knows Jesus could have prevented it, she just falls at his feet and does what she can. And she can't do much except just say, Lord, I know if you had been here, he wouldn't be dead. And that's kind of where the conversation ends, because there's not much more to say. But what she does is she shows submission to Christ when she just has nothing else to do. She says, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to submit to the Lord. I'm not going to stand against him and wag my finger at him. I don't know. So I do what I can. So Mary she finds a seat, learning from Jesus, and she finds submission. When things are tough, she does what she can. And then you see that she has this, you could call it Mary's surrender in chapter 12, which is the same passage we're looking at in Mark chapter 14, that now she's set aside this alabaster box, and now she's going to give something that's actually going to cost her something, a great deal of money. And the whole point here, I think, was that it was a great deal of money to show her great amount of gratitude to Christ. And it wasn't so much about whether this was going to, accomplish physical goals, like feeding the poor. It was more about, does what I'm doing, is it going to glorify God and show my faith in him? And that's exactly what it did. When no one else believed him that he was going to die, Mary says, I believe you. And she takes ointment to prove it and acts accordingly. Now, she probably, I don't know if she had an idea how soon Jesus was going to die, because we know from John chapter 12 that this was 6 days before before the Passover. So this was 6 days before the Last Supper, right? This was less than a full, about 8 days, about 7 days, less than probably a full 7 days before Jesus would die. This is it's coming a lot sooner than she probably even realizes. Otherwise, she probably would have saved it and used it after he died. But she's showing that she believes him. And he said, remember to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And I wonder if she's also wondering if after Jesus dies, if he's going to raise himself back from the dead. I'm not sure what's going through her mind. But Jesus is on a march to death here. Because when the Jews see him in Bethany, they're going to go and tell the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are ready. The very next day, many people are going to gather to celebrate him entering into the city. It's Palm Sunday, if you will, the triumphal entry. But the Pharisees are now ready to kill him, and this begins that week. This is the beginning of the last week of Jesus' life. And it starts with him being anointed to death. Remember what the wise men brought Jesus on Christmas? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? Gold, because he's the king. Frankincense, because he's a priest. But myrrh, because he was going to die. This was an embalming spice, myrrh was. And myrrh is the phase of life that Jesus is going into. And Mary here doesn't know what she can do. She certainly can't stop them from killing Christ. She certainly can't change the future. She certainly doesn't like what is coming, but she's going to submit to Christ and do what she can. And I wonder, as we're taking this now and just turning the fingers back around at ourselves, and instead of pointing at Mary, we start to point at ourselves. I wonder if sometimes, our service to God can often become conditional on things working out the way we want them to work out, But here's Mary, who knew for a fact that things were not going to go the way she wanted them to go. Jesus was going to die. She believed it. And instead of fighting against it, she said, okay, what can I do to honor you in this death? What can I do to show my faithfulness to you? What can I do? And I wonder if we've ever asked ourselves the question, what else can I do? Have I done all that I can? It doesn't matter if you think whatever you can do will be effective. The question is, have you done what you can? Have I done what I can? I was this last week I was in CPAC down in Orlando, Florida, and that was a fun experience. It wasn't my first time. After a while, important people walking by down a hallway isn't all that big of a deal. Seeing Ted Cruz or somebody. The first time I saw it, I thought it was pretty cool. After that, it's just everyone else is running after him, you got this whole crowd. But anyway, I thought it was interesting. I went down and I went through the vendors down there, and I was picking up little pieces of paper off their tables, because with the show that I do, I was going to interview some of these people. And one of the vendors, one of the guys in my group there said, you need to go over to this vendor, because he knows that that I'm a pastor, and he says, this is Atheists for Liberty. That's the group. That's the name of the group, Atheists for Liberty. They're conservative atheists, and which is an oxymoron. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. You cannot be conservative and atheist, because conservatives say that there are absolute right and wrong things, and atheists have no basis for saying that. If an atheist says that something is right or wrong, then they're being disingenuous with atheism, right? You cannot prove from naturalism any absolute wrong, right? We talked about this a little bit in the men's Sunday school. But if you say that it is always wrong to torture babies for fun, right? I think we can all agree with that, right? It's always wrong to torture. This is an absolute, always wrong to torture babies for fun. But if an atheist agrees to that, which of course an atheist wants to agree with that, then he also has to say why, because nature doesn't give us that. I mean, it's not wrong for a mother to eat her children. It's not wrong for a wife in nature to eat her husband, right? Spiders do this, right? These types of things happen all the time in nature. There's nothing wrong about it. It's just the way nature works. If it is wrong, if there are things that are actually wrong, which conservatism affirms, then there has to be a higher power that says that they're wrong. It doesn't come from nature. So anyway, the point is atheism doesn't work with conservatism, and I'm a little off track here. But someone told me I need to go talk to him, so I said, all right, I will. And I went and talked to him, and I told him, I said, I think you're dead wrong here, but I'd like to have a dialogue with you about it. Would you mind coming on the show sometime and let's talk about it? And people were asking me why I invited an atheist to come onto my show, because my show is all about the Bible, and politics in relation to the scriptures. And I said, listen, it's because there's something a little bit more important than politics, and it's the gospel. And I want to give this guy the gospel. And of course the question came up, do you really think it's going to matter? Do you really think that this atheist guy, who's the president of Atheists for Liberty, is going to get saved? I said, probably not. If I'm being honest, I probably don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference, but I'm going to do what I can. If I can give him the gospel, I'm going to do it. It's probably not going to make a difference, but I'm going to do it. And this is kind of how we have to look at our service to God. It's not about, what can I accomplish for God? I think that's a wonderful question. Are you going to accomplish great things for God? But I think it also is a very misleading question, because it's not about accomplishing things for God. It's about doing what you can. What has God given you, and what are you using? How are you using that for Him? Have we done what we can? Father in heaven, what an amazing lesson we could learn from this woman who made a choice that I don't think most of us would make, to take a year's worth of salary and pour it at the feet of Jesus. Lord, help us to learn from her that we must also do what we can. I pray that you'd help us to really examine our lives and say, am I doing what I can for Christ? We know that so many of the results of our work and our labor for you will never be seen this side of heaven. We'll never know. It will seem, in many cases, it'll seem like it was all for nothing. But one day we'll see how you used it. And help us just to do what we can.